Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books, out loud, while stoned. In this video, we're going to do part 2 of Little Blue Book, number 1066, titled The Forgery of the Old Testament, written by Joseph McCabe. Now this will be video 2, so in this we'll be doing chapters 3 and 4. And what are they? Chapter 3 is The Priestly Forgers, and Chapter 4, The Mistakes of Moses. And let's see, page 20 is where we begin. Okay, chapter 3, The Priestly Forgers. What I mean when I say that the Old Testament was forged will now be fairly clear. In the first place, whole books like Daniel are what we call in modern English forgeries. And if the Jews of 2200 or even 2500 years ago had known the real origin of them, they would have called them forgeries. They were effective and were intended to be effective, only because the readers were induced to believe that the events they described had actually happened. That Yahweh could be made to do wonderful things in mere fiction would not have been a surprise to any Oriental or anybody else. So the fiction was represented as fact, and the authorship was concealed under a spurious name. We shall see presently in what sense this applies to the supposed authorship of the Pentateuch by Moses, or the Psalms by David, or in a large part of Isaiah. Here we will consider the Old Testament as a whole. It professes to be, and the Orthodox believe it to be, a collection of books which appeared at intervals with divine inspiration during 1,000 years of Jewish history. It is supposed that Moses wrote or caused to be written the Pentateuch, except the last few verses. It is believed that Judges, Kings, and Chronicles go back to the times they describe, that the prophecies were added from the 9th century onward, and so on. Now, the critical theory is that not a single book of the Old Testament, as we have it, is older than the 9th century, and that the 5th century, all the older books and fragments were combined together into the Old Testament as we have it, and were drastically altered, so as to yield a version of early Hebrew history, which is not true. It is believed that this was done by the Jewish priests, and that fact, not prejudice, is the reason for the title of this chapter. The object of this manipulation of the Hebrew writings was, according to all scholars, to represent the Jewish priesthood and its rites and customs to have been established in the days of Moses. All the scholars to whom I refer admit this, and admit that the representation is false, and so, not being either a priest or a professor, or other polite person, I speak of priestly forgers. You shall please yourself. But to understand the facts, we must glance at Jewish history. The next 2 chapters will examine the Old Testament version of that history, and I need not go into controversial details here. The origin of the Hebrew race is obscure. What we now know is that the Arabian Peninsula generally was the cradle, the hive of the Semitic tribes, and owing to the great fertility of their women and the great sterility of their soil, they constantly spread from this to the north and west. The Babylonians were Semites, who took over the civilization of Mesopotamia from the earlier Sumerians. No doubt, Semitic tribes or families peacefully one page too many. There we go. Peacefully invaded the Babylonian Empire, and though the name Abraham is clearly legendary, as we shall see, it is possible that a Semitic family went from Ur, one of the oldest Babylonian cities, to distant Palestine. What we know is that the Palestinian tribes, Moabites, Edomites, etc., generally were Semites, who had come into this relatively good country from the desert and settled there. The Hebrews are one of these tribes. They came late, found the land full and were allowed only to settle on the poor hilly lands of what became Judea. We know that some of these nomad tribes wandering about the desert fringe of Palestine and Egypt begged to be admitted to the outlying lands of the delta of the Nile. Some of the Hebrew tribes may have done this. That they ever settled in Egypt proper, it is difficult to believe, as there is no trace of this in the ample Egyptian remains. It is generally denied by scholars, but I should be disposed to look for some historical nucleus of the legend about the long stay in Egypt, and it may be that they were for some time in the Delta. The earliest historical mention of them is about 1200 BC. An Egyptian record of that time, which seems to refer to them, says that Isrula has been vanquished. They had apparently settled on the fringe of Palestine, which belonged to Egypt, and were included in some chastisement of frontier tribes. Let us take it provisionally that they had leaders called judges and presently kings. As to the virtues of David and glories of Solomon, we shall see later. It is generally admitted that by the 10th century or so, they were sufficiently civilized to commit some of their historical traditions and old war songs to writing. Hebrew is the language of Canaan, and Canaan was quite civilized when the Jews arrived. It is now thought that the Philistines had brought to it the old civilization of Crete, about 1450 BC. An Egyptian and Babylonian culture had flowed over it for ages. It is important to remember that these were civilized more than 1,000 years before anybody claims that the Hebrews were civilized. The legends and law and religions of both were well known throughout Palestine. It is, in fact, now generally held that the Hebrew written language is derived from the hieroglyphics of Egypt, though the Babylonian script was at the time also well known in Palestine. The earliest inscriptions in Hebrew are the Moab stones, 9th century, and the Shalom inscription, 8th century. One of the most recent works on the subject is the Introduction to the Old Testament of Professor Sullen, a Berlin theologian. I'm going to make much use of this because the author is not advanced, but conservative. But when Professor Sullen claims that the Hebrews could write about 1300 BC, and therefore their oldest historical traditions may have been in writing since then, I look carefully for his proofs. I find they are all from the Old Testament itself, the very book whose credibility as history is disputed. University professors ought to be more logical. However, Professor Sullen presently enters upon a discussion of Deuteronomy, and we will follow him. Let me ask any religious reader to get out his Bible and read 2 Kings, 22, and 2 Chronicles 34. It is there described how about 622 BC, Hilkiah, the priest, found in the book of the law of the Lord, given by Moses. The priest gives it to a scribe, who reads it and takes it to the king and reads it to him. It causes a sensation. It was so extraordinary, so remote from the actual religious life of the Jews, that the king rent his garments, a fearful sign of agitation in so economical a race, and then sent the priest to consult a witch or prophetess, which the Bible sternly forbids. Then a crowd of the people was got together, and the strange law was read to them. There seem to have been murmurs. One can imagine hard-headed Jewish merchants remarking that it was strange that the priest had so completely forgotten their own charter and roles. Stranger still that their aspiring high priest should conveniently find it in the temple at a time when a pious and simple-minded monarch sat on a throne. In fact, read your prophet Jeremiah, the best of his class, at, let's see, 5, 6, at 8, so 8, chapter 8, verse 8, I guess. As I have said, they consulted a witch, not the great Jeremiah. And these words tell you why. How do ye cry? We are wise, and the law of the Lord is with us. But behold, the false pen of the scribes hath wrought falsely. In Hebrew, it means a lie. Jeremiah, the best man of the time, saw the trick. The book was a forgery. However, King Josiah swore very hard that, as this law was given by Moses, they had to observe it. Rival religions, which were much patronized, were suppressed. Yahweh alone could be worshipped. His priests became enormously powerful. This is not higher criticism. It is in the Bible. Candidly, what do you think of it? The higher critics say that Hilkiah touched up an old law or tradition by conflation and contamination. Strange that he knew the old law so well, yet it so much astonished even the king. Obviously, it was not in the least being carried out, though the priest knew it well enough to write it out. Professor Sullen is sure that, whatever happened, the document was not forged with the convenience of the priest, but unfortunately, he has little evidence to offer us beyond his personal conviction of this. Fundamentalists and Catholics say that it really was the law of Moses, which blazes with the imprecations on those who neglect it, and it had been left for centuries in a cellar, entirely forgotten, and, of course, there was only one copy. And so far fallen into disuse that the king would not believe it until a witch confirmed it. What do you think? This roll of papyrus, or whatever it was read by the scribe and then read by him to the king in one day. Apparently, it was an hour or two of reading. The Pentateuch consists of 150,000 words and could not be read in a day. So, it was not the Pentateuch. So, likes to use that word so to begin sentences. So, the Pentateuch, as we have it, did not then exist, or it would have contained this law. The book was not even Deuteronomy, as we have it, for it contains 30,000 words, and as writing then was, could not be read by a scribe to a king in less than 10 hours. This startling thing, a thing to be read slowly, was read twice in a day, and then at a public meeting. It was not deuteronomy, which means second law, but, to coin a word, proteronomy, proteronomy, or first law. High priest Hilkiah had fabricated the first sketch of the rules, prerogatives, and rights of the Hebrew priesthood, and he ascribed the authorship to Moses. Still, there was no Pentateuch. Let me repeat that. It would have contained this law and a good deal more, and, for reasons which we shall see in the next chapter, there could not be. Then there was a period of obscure disorder, lit only by the writings called Ezra and Nehemiah. How far they lit up the period? Well, let us consult the conservative Professor Sullen, and that redoubtable enemy of the higher critics, Professor Sayce. Ezra and Nehemiah, Professor Sullen concludes, were indifferent to, or perhaps ignorant of, the strict order of events. Is there any order of events which is not strict? Anyhow, the professor assures us that they do not tell us the truth, and, strange to say, he is quite prepared to believe that they did not care whether they told the truth or not. Professor Sayce is just as uncomplimentary to the inspired writings. They are full of errors, he says. We shall see in the next chapter, but one that doesn't make sense. We shall see in the next chapter, but one why even professors of the late moderate school have to say these things. The Bible contradicts the Bible, and we can have no hesitation as to which version we have to believe. We are, in fact, on the threshold of the greatest event in Jewish history as far as this book is concerned, and the facts had to be concealed by spurious statements. The Jews were, as I said in the first chapter, deported to Babylon. and the demoralized mass of country folk who remained in Palestine, as well as the bulk of the deportees, fell away from the faith. The destruction of the temple and its priesthood meant all were free to follow their own inclination away from religion. The priest had to make a drastic effort to bring them back. In the year 438, Ezra, a zealous priest, returned from Babylon to Jerusalem with a party of zealots. Some years earlier, a Jew named Nehemiah, who had become cupbearer of the Persian king and had therefore much favor at court, had gone to Jerusalem and tried to restore religion, but had failed. Ezra, the priest, succeeded. He brought with him the book of the law of Moses and had it read to an assembly of the people, with the usual consternation and revolution in the religious life. I'm going to pause there for a moment. Okay, I had to pause and pick up my drink. So we'll pick up where I left off. We must postpone the examination of the supposed historical works, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the on-canonical 1 and 2 Esdras, until the 5th chapter, but I will there show that they are forgeries perpetrated several centuries after the events. The quotations from Selon and Sayce given above are mild. No scholar regards them as history, and some maintain that the entire story they tell is a fabrication, except the fact that a priestly party headed by Ezra, in Greek Esdras, again imposed some law of Moses upon the people. This law was what is known in biblical science as the priestly code, mainly Leviticus. It was obviously new in Judea, and, says our Reverend Professor Selon, in the Old Testament today, its contents stand out with a peculiar distinctiveness, so that even the non-expert can recognize them without difficulty. It was, he concludes, worked up in Babylon about 500 BC. It was, in its main provisions, quite new to the Jews, and its plain aim was to represent the priesthood as endowed with all the rights and functions described in Leviticus, nearly 1,000 years earlier than 500 BC. The writers, Professor Selon thinks, used old material. He is unable to trace it, of course, and impressed upon it the stamp of the new ideas, that is to say, deliberately falsified history to suit their purposes. Professor Selon is quite sure that Ezra was unaware of any forgery. He is sure of this because Ezra and Nehemiah, which he holds to have been written a century later and to be mere romances, tell us that Ezra had a great reverence for this book. Funny how professors write sometimes. It is the almost universal opinion of scholars that a priestly group in Babylon, using some old material, fabricating new, and perverting the entire history of the cult and the priesthood, made this priestly code and ascribed it to Moses. Is that a forgery? It is equal to the almost universal opinion that in Jerusalem they went on to combine this code, again falsifying the historical facts, with the older existing writings and made the Pentateuch, nearly as we have it. I give sufficient evidence of this in the 5th chapter. As to Ezra himself, remember that he was not only a zealous priest, but a ready scribe in the law of Moses. In fact, for once, I think we shall find much food for thought in an apocryphal work, First Esdras. That is First Esdras 14. Yeah, First Esdras 14:22. I, Ezra, shall write all that hath been done in the world since the beginning, and the things that were written in thy law. He and his associates did. The old Hebrews, admitting that he wrote the whole Pentateuch, used to say that he had revelation to help him. The clerical professors say that he had some mysterious fund of old materials, which he worked up and made to serve his purpose. What do you think? Remember, this book made the priesthood all-powerful for the first time in Judea. That's the end of chapter 3. Now we're going to chapter 4, the mistakes of Moses. But first, I'm going to hydrate. Hydrate, Maddie. Okay, now we move on to chapter 4, the mistakes of Moses. Now, let us examine the Pentateuch, or 5 books, with which the Old Testament opens. One smiles today at the vast amount of ink that was spilt in the 19th century over the question whether Moses wrote them. There is now no scholar who would entertain the idea. The only foundation for any belief that Moses wrote or dictated them is a statement in precisely those passages in Kings, Chronicles, and Ezra, all very late books, in which the forgers produce them and say that Moses wrote them. Nice evidence, that. But let us look at the first 2 pages from another point of view. We have already seen how absurd is the idea that if you exclude the teaching of evolution from the schools, all will be well with orthodoxy. You may exclude the higher criticism from the colleges also, and orthodoxy is in as bad a position as ever. For the first page of the Bible is in flat contradiction to what every child now knows. And even the pious work of the Reverend Professor Sayce, issued still by the Society for the Promotion of Christian Knowledge, of a fundamentalist shade, proves empathetically that the early chapters of Genesis are modifications of Babylonian legends. Attempts to reconcile Genesis and science never come now from men who know science. The Hebrew text, which I know well, having had a course of Hebrew in Louvain University, is not 1 inch nearer to science than the English text. It is neither poetry, I have read it in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, and English, nor accurate statement. Let us glance at it. There is first a dark chaos created by God. Why God created matter in a chaotic state and then in 6 days put it in order is rather a puzzle to the believer. It would be just as easy for the creative word to make an orderly as a chaotic universe. Desperate apologists remind you how science, which they pretend not to believe, put a nebula at the beginning, and one might, if one did not know Hebrew, think of the chaos as a nebula. But a nebula is light, not dark, and it is most assuredly has no water in it. Let us use our common sense. The Hebrew for the chaos is tohu vabohu, which is plainly a primitive people's corruption of the Babylonian Tiamat. The original chaos, as we shall see, to the learned Babylonian, the first state of things was a watery wasteland, and water mixed up together, and the gods had first to separate them. The Hebrew follows the Babylonian legend and all that it says. But this is really waste of time. Any man who thinks that the teaching of science is in harmony with the Genesis order of creation, 1 light, 2 division of water by the sky or firmament, 3 division of land from water and creation of plants, including fruit trees, 4 appearance of the sun and moon, 5 production of birds from the water, 6 production of reptiles after birds, and mammals, and man ought to try politics instead of theology. It is sheer nonsense. Moreover, the 2nd chapter of Genesis makes matters worse by putting first the creation of man, then trees, then mammals, then woman. It is frankly ridiculous to talk of science in such a connection. The only agreement with science, and this is undone by the 2nd chapter, is that the grass was created before the cattle which eat it, and the cattle before the man who eats them. I say this quite deliberately after, for the 100th time, reading slowly the 1st chapter of Genesis. Seriously, does one need inspiration to guess that? Read the virtuous and admirable Sayce. The higher critics do not enter this controversy. He will show you how Canaan was saturated with Babylonian culture and legends long before the Hebrews got there. And in Morals in Ancient Babylon, Little Blue Book number 1076, I tell all about their legends of creation and show how, beyond a shadow of a doubt, they are the sources of Genesis. The primitive chaos, the coming of light first to it, the firmament dividing the waters, the late creation of sun and moon to rule the sky and the night, the 7 days of the week, the rest upon the seventh, the successive creations. Everything is there. Next, as to chronology, I have heard fundamentalist leaders scoff at the idea that the Bible puts creation about 4000 BC. In a debate with me, Dr. Riley has said that he is quite prepared to admit that, as science claims, the Earth is more than 1 billion years old. But if the reader cares to go through Genesis carefully and note that the age of each patriarch at the time his first son was born, he will find that the Old Testament does actually date creation about 6,000 years ago. I have done it. You try. Then there is the lovely Garden of Eden. Quite plainly, we now know the Babylonian Eden, or plain, and the ghastly story of the curse of the whole human race for the sin of two people. It is a Babylonian story, and the Hindus, Egyptians, and others had the same story. As to Noah and the flood, I imagine that every theologian in the world has thrown up the sponge on that wonderful specimen of early man's idea of what God might do. It is all in the Babylonian tablets, even down to such details as the sending out of the dove and the raven and the resting of the ark on a high mountain. I quote all this in Morals of Ancient Babylon. Pause to hydrate. Throat's feeling a little rough. The story of Babel also is a childlike legend of which we have traces in Babylonia. It is naive enough in the Old Testament. God gets jealous of a man's progress in civilization. Man has built a city which is clearly meant for Babylon. Consult the Admirable Sayce. And a high tower, which means one of the lofty stepped temples of Babylonia. The whole story is a very primitive attempt to explain how men came to speak different languages. We have today actual specimens of the Cretan, Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Chinese languages going back ages before the alleged date of Babel. When, in Morals of Ancient Babylon, Little Blue Book, number 1078, here we go. Let me pause this. And Religion and Morals in Ancient Egypt, Little Blue Book number 1077, I describe the elaborate religions and mythologies of Babylonia and Egypt, and show how they were mighty empires before the supposed time of the flood, and how their culture spread over the entire region. All this will be fully understood, but I am not aware that any scholar, clerical or lay, of our time questions the Babylonian origin of the Genesis legends. And we need not anticipate here by reproducing the ancient stories. We do not suggest that the Jews adopted these legends during the captivity. They were probably well known in Canaan, and were indeed probably the only available answers to the riddle of the universe when the Hebrews arrived there. It is probable, in fact, that they were written in a Hebrew version centuries before the captivity, but no one can read the Babylonian originals, which we now have, and doubt the ultimate source of the early chapters of Genesis. Properly educated clergymen admit this, and say that the inspiration is seen in the change from polytheism to monotheism. The very first line in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, is said to rise high above all ancient literature. But in the Babylonian legend itself, it is one God, Marduk, who puts chaos in order and creates the world. And I show in the Origin of Religion, and prove more amply in Morals in Ancient Babylon and Religion and Morals in Ancient Egypt, that monotheism was established in Egypt centuries before a line of the Old Testament was written. It is precisely one of the boasts of the worthy Professor Sayce that the monuments have confirmed the existence and monotheism of Melchizedek in the time of Abraham, and our other moderate professor, Selon, remarks that not only is the second Hebrew name for God Elohim a plural noun, but in some verses of the Old Testament it actually has, in the Hebrew text, a plural verb. Even in the early books of the Bible, it is clear that the Hebrews did not deny the existence of other gods, but their priests restricted them, not very successfully, to the worship of Yahweh. It is more interesting and useful to tell here what a century of analysis has brought out as regards the composition of Genesis and the other earlier books of the Old Testament. The name higher criticism is really wrong. The so-called critics are all clerics, and we have seen how lenient they are. And their work for more than 100 years has consisted mainly in a literary analysis of the text. They are now all agreed on certain general conclusions which I will describe. It is quite clear from the style and language alone that two very early writings have been used, a fragment here and a fragment there, in the compilation of the Pentateuch and early historical books. One of these calls God Yahweh, a name which no one understands and some think a mountain or thunder god adopted by the Hebrews, and the other Elohim, the plural word, gods. These early documents are therefore called the Yahvist and Elohist documents. Well, that makes sense, doesn't it? Popular, I'm going to make sure I turned the right page. Yep. Popular evangelical writers, always inaccurate and never having a knowledge of Hebrew, represent that it is only the two names of God which have led biblical students to distinguish two documents, as if, they say, one and the same writer might not, as we do, call the Almighty by two or three names. This is sheer ignorance. According to even Professor Selon, one of these documents was written in the 10th century BC, the other in the 9th century, and the Old Testament as a whole compiled in the 5th century. Now, think of a piece of English literature of the 15th century and compare it with modern English. A child could see the difference. Hence, Hebrew scholars have been quite able to pick out by their style the bits of these early documents and put them together. Well, you say, if this Yahvist wrote in the 9th or 10th century, Selon says in the time of David, he is likely to give us some reliable facts about early history. We shall see in a moment whether he does or not. Even what he says about David is allowed only a kernel of fact. He is valuable only as having, it is believed, preserved old songs and sayings like the Song of Lamech, the triumphal song of the Red Sea, the blessing of Jacob, the Decalogue, and so on. But they must be taken as poetry, not history. It is generally said that he has preserved some remnants of Moses in the book of the Covenant, but this is now known to be a pale reflection of the code of laws of the Babylonian king Hammurabi, as Professor Selon admits. These two early writings were, we can tell, combined in the 8th and 7th century. I say combined, but the two contradictory accounts of creation in Genesis 1 and 2, the first Elohist, the second Yahvist, show how clumsily it was done. These duplications and contradictions run through 2/3 of the Old Testament. In the 9th century, as we shall see, prophets appeared, and a new sort of literature began. In the 7th century, as we have already seen, a very important new work, Deuteronomy, a forged version of the giving of the law and institution of the priesthood by Moses, was imposed upon the people by the priests, and it seems probable that the priest combined this with the Yahvist Elohist work shortly before the exile of the 6th century. Cover's coming off. This was the Law, a very small book compared with our Pentateuch, but it fell into complete disuse at the fall of the temple, and as we saw, the group of exiled priests forged a new and larger document, making their power greater than ever and carrying back its origin to the days of Moses. This was, in the main, Leviticus. On their return to Jerusalem, they combined this with the older writings, resolutely perverting and falsifying the whole early history so as to represent, as we now read, that Yahweh was the one God of the Hebrews from the start, and that he gradually, on a deliberate plan, led them up to the complete establishment of his cult. Thus, with a few later modifications, arose the Pentateuch, and Professor Solon, who admits all this except the word forgery, piously concludes that the Christian Church does well to retain it as the record of the divine plan, fabricated by a group of priests who got great profit and prestige thereby. The historical works still lay apart. In fact, most of them had not been written. The Sumerians, who took the Pentateuch with them when they seceded from the Jews, had not Joshua. This was the next fabrication out of ancient material, 430 to 400 BC. But here we approach a new aspect of the Bible, and I will turn back to what is thought to be the beginning of Hebrew history, the story of Abraham, and inquire how far the Bible contains history. That's the end of chapter 4, and that's where we'll stop. For today's video, part 2 of Little Blue Book number 1066, titled The Forgery of the Old Testament, written by Joseph McCabe, copyright 1926. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 3.